like anti-teacher.
Okay, looking for everybody to be facing my direction.
We use those cameras.
You actually do not need your pencil yet, so you can just put it inside your clipboard or somewhere where it won't distract you. And Eva and Colin, we're not going to use the smart board, so turn your bodies this way. Noah, turn around just a little bit. Okay. So you guys, I've been working with your teachers a lot this year. One thing I've noticed about them is that they're really dedicated to finding high quality, good, interesting books for you to read. So they take a lot of time to do their research on what good books are, and they don't just pull any old book off the shelf to try to teach you something. They want it to be a juicy book that can teach you something. So you should appreciate that about them, because they take a lot of time to pick out interesting books for you guys. And so this week, I'm going to help your class have deeper conversations about these great books that your teachers are selecting. Okay, because that's what great books do. They lead us into great conversations. Eyes this way, Noah. So in order to do that, we're going to stick with our read aloud norms, conversation norms that we practiced last week when we did the string activity. But I'm going to push you to do something more. I'm going to ask you guys to be the teachers and you guys to be thinking like teachers. What am I going to ask you to do?
Think like teachers.
And think like teachers. Very good. So good teachers, they read a book and then they, in their head, and even in writing, are coming up with good questions to ask the class about the book. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. You're going to be in charge of coming up with deep questions that your whole class can have a really interesting conversation about. You're in charge of thinking of those deep questions. So before I ask you to do that, I'm going to teach you what a deep question is. Okay? Usually, this is usually true, there's not one right answer to a deep question. This way, Colin. Usually, a deep question can be discussed for long periods of time. Like I think last week when we did the string activity, we spent that whole time talking about one question, about the relationship, family relationships. And lastly, the answers to deep questions aren't usually right there in the book. You can't just flip to the page and say, that's the answer. You have to make inferences to come up with possibilities, answers to the questions. So 3 things. There might be more qualities of deep questions, but these are the things that came to my head right away. Not one right answer. They're discussed for long periods of time. I'll wait for everybody to get focused. And you usually have to do some inferring to think about the answer. And you can always use the text to make your inferences, but you have to go a little bit beyond. Have you guys heard about the iceberg model at all? Have you talked about that?
Iceberg what?
Iceberg model. So some people like to think of an iceberg when they're thinking about deep questions. So an iceberg, you might know, has part of it, just pretend these are the clouds, that's above the surface of the water. So here's the water, and here's your iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is what they say. The part that floats above the surface of the water that you can see, hopefully, if you're in a ship or you're in the water. But most of the iceberg, do you know where it is? It's below the surface of the water, and you cannot actually see it unless you go deep, right? So your questions, you're going to have to go deep to find the answers to. They're going to be down here, okay? Not up here on the surface. So I came up with some questions that I wanted us to sort into 2 categories. Can I have a roll of tape, please? I'm sorry. Deep or surface level. Real quick.
It's like when some scientists do is they go under cold waters to see things almost like because they want to see what's underneath.
To get a better perspective, exactly.
Because sometimes people find fossils underneath.
You can find all kinds of interesting things and ideas when you go deep. The glue stick would also work. So we have, here's a roll.
I was going to say, if there's one with the studio on the list.
So I have some questions that I want you to sort. deep or surface level. Surface level means that there might only be one right answer. You can't talk about it for a long amount of time, and sometimes the answers are right there. So the first question I have here, how did the relationship between Papa and Reginald change, and why? So think about if we were to talk about this. Would this be a deep question that we could talk about for a little while?
Yes.
Or would it be a surface level question that we'd be over and done with real fast?
It just depends.
Shout it out, what do you think?
Surface.
Surface.
I hear a combination of ideas. Maybe didn't we kind of talk about this the other day? And we did have a long discussion about it. So this is an example of a deep question, and that's okay if you didn't get that right off the bat. We'll do a couple more examples. So I'm going to put this down below at the bottom. Okay. What was the score of the game?
Surface.
Why do you think it's a surface level question, Ethan?
It's not really something that's very important to
Yeah, you don't have to know the score of the game to understand why the author wrote the book, to understand what the book was about. Does anybody even remember the score of the game? I don't.
It was
17 to 18.
Okay, some of you have good memories.
But
Okay, so surface level, I'm going to put it up high here at the top.
another reason would be because there's one right answer.
Right. You can't really argue about what the score of the game was, or debate it, or discuss it.
Unless you remember.
Okay, what about this one? Can you read it, Maddox?
What might the author be trying to teach us?
I have it. Mr. McGrady, please call 7201. Mr. McGrady, please call 7201.
Through writing this book. Deep. Those questions about author's message are almost always really juicy ones for conversation. What is the author trying to teach us? And I would love to talk about that with this. We did kind of talk about that with this book. We talked about how the author was trying to teach us about families. That's okay. But another thing we could talk about is what was the author trying to teach us about civil rights in that book? That goes along with our next question. Can you read it, Calvin?
What made this book a story about civil rights? And what did we learn about that time in history?
What do you think, deep or surface level?
I'm thinking deep.
Yeah.
Can I answer?
And you notice that the deep questions are a lot of times longer
Yeah.
than the surface level questions. I'm just gonna have to cover up our iceberg here. Okay. Can you read this one, Deja?
What song did Reg play on his violin?
What do you think? Deep or surface level?
That
Yeah.
wasn't the point.
Not the point, right?
It was just something that.
Because you said that.
Well,
It's not really a point, but it could be something that made the team play better. It's like their favorite kind of music.
Yeah, and you know, it's not that it's not important to know
Yeah, it's
the
just not too
answers
good
to
of a
surface
question.
level questions, but they might not lead to as deep of a discussion. Okay? Let's just do two more. Daniel?
Why was Papa so angry at the beginning?
Actually,
What do you think, Daniel?
I think it could be surface and kind. I think it maybe kind of in the middle because it seems like it could lead to a really good conversation because it would lead to talking about everything. But yeah, I think that it's kind of in the middle.
I think that's an interesting point. That you might be able to give a quick answer about why Papa was angry.
But
Like, oh, he had a bad day at work, or
Depending on the
he
answer.
wanted Reggie to play ball instead of play the violin. But if you dig deep and you start really thinking about what's happening in Papa's life and with the baseball league, and what's happening with civil rights, you could probably have a pretty deep conversation about that. Last question. Last question, London.
what were the characters' names?
Surface.
Yeah, but you do need to know that to have a conversation, don't you? It's pretty hard to talk about a book if you don't know their name. Okay, so you guys seem to have a really good grasp on that. So we're going to actually practice.
Oh, really at the surface. Yeah, like.
Yep. We're going to practice having you guys actually write the questions. We have a new book today. It's called Tea with Milk, and it's another awesome book that your teachers have picked out for you. As I'm reading, you're jotting, okay? As I'm reading, your job is to jot down interesting things that come up and things that would be interesting to talk about with the class in depth. And then I'll give you a little time at the very end to wrap it up and write at least one deep question that you're going to give to Ms. Thompson and I, and then we're going to choose from those questions for the next grand conversation. Okay? So I want you to get caught up in this story, but I also want you to be thinking like a teacher as you're reading.